Hello, welcome back. I am still here. I've been sick. I feel like for the whole month of December, but it hasn't been quite that bad. I took a trip the second weekend of December, a long weekend trip with my daughter and son and her boyfriend down to Florida to see my mother. It was so much fun. And I've been sick since I got back. So I am going to try not to cough during this video. That's my main goal. I have my water here. So we'll see. I just wanted to do a little bit of catching up and what I've read. I barely remember, but most of everything I'm reading has been library books. So I've kept a hold of the library books that I finished when I got back from Florida, just so that I could remember what they are and I could have them to talk about. But I took 2 books to Florida with me, and they were like the perfect ones to read while I was there in terms of the tone and the atmosphere. I loved this book, Case Study. I haven't heard too many people talking about it on BookTube or even on Bookstagram, but the couple things I've heard haven't been real positive. I knew that this was a book right up my alley when I heard it was about a woman who was suspecting that I'm going to call him a psychiatrist, but he could be a psychologist, was responsible for her sister's tragic suicide. Her sister jumped off a bridge. And based on the psychiatrist's reputation and some books that he wrote on the subject of suicide, she really felt like he was responsible. And she goes undercover and acts as a patient to try and get the inside scoop on this guy. It is an unreliable narrator story. It's first person, and it's written as if the psychiatrist Colin Braithwaite is real. So you see inside, like there's a preface, and it talks about Colin Braithwaite as if he's real. And then it's got some of his files that were somehow, somebody got a hold of them, and you have files in here, and it's done as if it's real. I love the writing. I love the story. I was a little confused about the ending, but I'll just say that you get to understand as you go through the story. Are things really as they appear? What's really going on? I loved it. So that's that one. And then I also took with me this lovely book in terms of its design called The Goodbye People by Gavin Lambert. This is who does this in terms of the publisher? I don't know if I'm going to find McNally. McNally does these editions where they have this cover over the cover. It was just the perfect book to take to Florida. I saw this on Bookstagram. It was definitely a case of Bookstagram made me do it. And I looked it up, and the library had it, and I got it. It's a reprint, so I got it when it was brand new at the library. And this is a story that was written in the 70s about Southern California artists, movie makers, actors, some wannabe actors, and just people that have enough money to get by. The protagonist is, as he's described here on the flap, a bisexual draft dodger living on the skids, and he happens to know enough people that he kind of gets into parties and hangs out with people, and he goes from like house to house. He's a drifter, but he's kind. And it was just one of those atmospheric novels that don't have any point whatsoever. I didn't need it to have a point. I just loved being in this atmosphere of sunny California in the 60s. Some people were genuine hippies and some people were Hollywood people. And so I loved it. Gavin Lambert is a guy who wrote for movies and wrote, I think, in all 5 novels, but he's not really somebody that, he's one of those unknown authors. Okay, I also read the brand new book by Audur Ava Olafsdottir, the Icelandic author. This is called Animal Life. I've read 2 of her books before this. One of them is, my first one was Hotel Silence, which I highly recommend. And the other was Miss Iceland. Some of her books have won prizes. And it is a translated book. She lives in Reykjavik. And what I love about her writing is the sparseness. She has a way of conveying character and place in a very spare way, and she lets the reader fill things in. Hotel Silence is by far my favorite of her books. This one was all right. It wasn't as good for me, as good a reading experience, as good a story. I don't know if I cared as much about the characters. This is about a midwife, and I'll just say present day, and she lives in an apartment which was her great aunt's apartment, and her great aunt was also a midwife. She comes from a long line of midwives. Her mother might have been a midwife. And there's somebody who's staying in the apartment, like one of the apartments is an Airbnb, and there's a little interaction with that guy. And she's going through her great aunt's papers. Her great aunt was writing a story, and she comes across a couple manuscripts of the story she was trying to write about animals and their spiritual powers and things like that. And the book was called Animal Life, this book that was never published. It was all right. I will read anything that Audur Ava Olafsdottir writes, but I highly recommend Hotel Silence. It's such a brilliant story. It is about a guy who's really down on his luck. I think he's newly divorced, really depressed. And it's not a spoiler to say, because it's described this way, that he's in Iceland and he goes to a very remote town, to a hotel in Iceland, and he's planning on killing himself by hanging in this hotel room. I know, it's awful. But what happens during his trip, he keeps getting distracted. His plans are delayed because this woman running the hotel sees that he brings a toolbox with him. And so she just assumes he's a handyman, and all of a sudden she needs a door fixed, and the window is leaking, and so on and so on. And the hotel turns out to be this central place that people in the townsfolk drop in and out of. And you can see what happens here. But the brilliant way the story is written was just my introduction to Olafsdottir. So highly recommend that one. All right, and now this behemoth, Power Failure, the rise and fall of American icon. It's the story of General Electric. I did not finish this book. It's humongous. So I'm not going to finish it. I did read a few chapters. I loved those few chapters, but I'm just not going to spend the time to finish it. But I loved what I read, and I really recommend this. Maybe it would be good on an audiobook. But I didn't know, or maybe I've forgotten, that General Electric was a company created by Thomas Edison and another guy. And together they formed what was first called Edison General Electric Company, and then became General Electric Company. And how it was the first electric company of its time, and how it, what grew out of the fact that there was an electric company, and how local electric companies formed and electrical grids formed as electricity grew and was used more and more. How they became very early on, at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, a government contractor. It's just a brilliant story. I just wish I had the time and maybe the impetus to keep reading. I mean, maybe I will listen to it on audiobook is really the way to do it. So I really do recommend this, even though I'm not going to finish it myself. Let's see, it is nearly 800 pages, 750 pages long. So that's that. All right, that's what I read, and I will just quickly go through what I'm currently reading, and I will wrap this up. I'm reading another Anita Brookner. I read Hotel du Lac earlier this year. I picked this up when I was in Florida. We went to an antique mall. It has a lot of books in the mall. They were having a sale. I'm kind of on a book buying ban until the end of the year. And but I wanted to pick up a couple books as a souvenir of my trip. And I am collecting Anita Brookners whenever I see them used. And this one is about, I feel like it was written in 1997, and I feel like it's taking place in the 90s, or it could take place in the 80s. But it's about a widow, Mrs. May. Her name is Dorothea, and they call her Thea. And her extended family is having a wedding. A niece is having a wedding, and in London, where she lives. And they're asking her if she could make room for somebody, the groom's best friend, Steve. And she doesn't want to be bothered. She loves living by herself. Her husband, Henry, has been dead for a few years. And you can just see how this is all going to turn into maybe a situation where maybe she doesn't mind having Steve around. It's so, like most Anita Brookner books, it's very subtle. It's so well written. It's just a wonderful place to be. You're in good hands. It's a pleasant read. So I'm enjoying it. Oh, Caledonia is another book that I've heard a lot about on some book podcasts. And this was written in the 90s. I feel like it's written in the 1940s, because I feel like that's when it takes place, and the writing is Gothic writing. So I had a hard time believing that it was written in the 90s, but it was. And Elspeth Barker, this was her one and only novel, and she wrote it when she was in her 50s. This edition has an introduction by Maggie O'Farrell, who was like working for the publisher, which I think is Virago, the wonderful press Virago at the time. And this is one of those stories that starts off in the first page. Just to give you an idea, even the flap says that the main character is dead. And in fact, she's been murdered. And this is a teenager named Janet, who is part of this family. A darkly humorous modern classic about a doomed adolescent girl So begins O Caledonia, with the body of 16-year-old Janet discovered in her Scottish Highlands home. There is no shortage of suspects in the murder of the unlovely and unloved Janet. This is not a whodunit. It's the story of the ill-fated Janet. And I am not quite halfway through, but Janet's got a dark side to her, but I don't understand yet why someone would kill her. So it's a really interesting story to have a 16-year-old murdered. And you know, at the beginning of the story that they catch the murderer and he goes to jail. They don't tell you who it is. But, and that, you know, the family didn't really make a big deal at the funeral. It's very sad, like in that way. But I don't feel sad reading it. It's such wonderful writing. So this is very interesting. On the front, Ali Smith has a quote that says, "One of the best, least known novels of the 20th century." I'm so glad I'm finally reading this. And then something that I read about, a brand new book I read about in the New York Times. I'm so glad I'm reading this. Also a poet. Frank O'Hara, My Father and Me, by Ada Calhoun. Ada Calhoun is a writer, and in 2018 she went to her parents' house. Her dad is Peter Sheldall. There's a J in there in the beginning, which I don't know, might be silent, and so I apologize if I'm completely messing up that name. But he was a writer or an artist of some sort. In the 60s, Ada Calhoun was a little girl in the 60s, and they lived in the East Village in New York City. And so she goes to the parents' house looking for something from her childhood in the basement or attic. And as she's rummaging through, she finds a file cabinet of cassette tapes, and they're labeled, and they're from like 1976, 1977, and they're clearly interviews that her father had with Frank O'Hara, the poet, apparently a well-known poet. Or, I'm sorry, not with Frank O'Hara, but with his friends, because Frank O'Hara died in the 1960s in a freakish accident on Fire Island. He was only in his 40s when he died. And so this is a story about Ada and her father and their discovery of poetry, and specifically Frank O'Hara's poetry. He wrote he published a book of poetry called Lunch Poems that he literally wrote at lunchtime when he was a young poet. And this is, you know, not the really, really famous people in New York City in the 60s, but other lesser known artists and writers. They mention, let's see, I jotted it down, Willem de Kooning, Edward Gorey. I love stories about 1960s New York City. Frank O'Hara was a gay man, so it also talks about gay life in the 60s. It's excellent writing. I'm just loving it so far. So that's that. I've taken way too long. I'm going to end this now, but thank you for hanging in there. And I would love to know what you're reading. If you've read any of these books that I'm reading, leave any thoughts or comments, and thanks for hanging in there. See ya.